Welcome to Lindamood-Bell Radio. I'm Dave Hungerford for Lindamood-Bell. Students everywhere have experienced learning loss in recent years, with disadvantaged students experiencing the largest impact. The American Rescue Plan provides an extraordinary opportunity for schools to invest in high-impact tutoring in proven programs. Lindamood-Bell professional development and tutoring services ensure that students get the targeted support they need to catch up and thrive academically. Our evidence-based approach is effective for at-risk students, including English learners and students in special education. Leverage American Rescue Plan funding for a scalable approach that will change the lives of your students. Visit lindamoodbell.com/proven tutoring or call us at 1-800-233-1819. In today's episode, my colleague from Lindamood-Bell for Schools, Dave Kiyvyra, is joined by Dr. Heidi O'Leary, the Director of Special Education for Maine School Administrative District 75.
Welcome, everyone, to the Lindamood-Bell Leaders in Literacy webinar series. My name is Dave Kiyvyra, Director of Development for Lindamood-Bell for Schools. And joining us today for our webinar on building a sustainable response to pandemic reading struggles is Heidi O'Leary, Director of Special Education from MSD 75. Heidi, why don't you take a moment and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about MSAD 75?
Sure, thanks. Thanks for inviting me, Dave. I really appreciate it. So my name's Heidi O'Leary. I'm the Special Education Director in MSAD 75, which encompasses 4 different towns: Bowdoin, Bowdenham, Harpswell, and Topsom. I've been a Special Education Director here for now 6 years, where I previously had my career in other districts. This district I came back to because it's my hometown and the community that I grew up in and the schools that I attended. So I was really happy when I became the director here. My background in education is I received my undergraduate from the University of Maine at Farmington a very long time ago. No need to say that date. And then my master's from New England College out of Henniker, New Hampshire back in 2010. And in 8 months, I will receive my doctorate. And so looking forward to that as well.
Congratulations. Yeah. That's great. That's great news. Excellent. Excellent. So today we're going to talk a little bit at the outset about what is the scientific model that Lindamood-Bell utilizes to address students' ability to learn how to read and to work with students who are having difficulty in learning how to read. And most importantly, we're then going to pivot and say, okay, great. So if that's the scientific theoretical model, how do you bring that into action in a school district, right? And Heidi's going to talk initially about sort of her decision-making and thinking around an immediate triage response to students' reading needs following the pandemic. A lot of folks refer to that as high-impact tutoring response. And then to say, great, now if we've got that immediate high-impact response, how do we build this capacity within the district so that this is something that can be provided long-term? So that's where we're going to head to in the discussion. And I wanted to start with a quote that I put up in a previous webinar, but really I think is poignant to the situation everyone's in, right? That there have been some very serious reading struggles that have shown up in students, particularly post-pandemic. And that one of the challenges around that is that a lot of students who are having pandemic-related reading issues may get labeled as students with a learning disability, even though they may not, in fact, have a learning disability. Now, that's always been an issue and a challenge within special education, is that there are students in special ed who don't necessarily need to be there. If we can deal with their reading issues, and we know that we can bring them out of that. And we could also keep a lot of students from going into special education if we can get them the right kind of instruction. And the reason why a lot of students struggle with reading really has to do with several underlying sensory cognitive functions that prevent them from being able to access content material, right? And get down on the page and read and comprehend in the way that we think that they should. And there's been lots and lots of discussion about phonemic awareness. So I know that everybody out there is very familiar with what phonemic awareness is, that ability to locate sounds within words so that as students begin to read, they can come across a word that they don't recognize, and they can sound out that word based on good phonemic awareness. The challenge that a lot of folks are seeing is that they'll see a lot of improvement in terms of students' word attack. But what we need a student to do is to sound out a word in one passage, and then when they see that same word in the next passage, what do we want them to do? We want them to just recognize it right away, right? Not have to rely on sounding it out all over again. And so they have to be able to build that connection of picturing the letters and matching those to sounds in their minds. A lot of folks refer to that as orthographic mapping. And what allows students to orthographically map sounds and letters within words is this cognitive function of symbol imagery. And that you can consciously and intentionally develop student symbol imagery, their ability to locate sounds and letters within words and picture those through developing their symbol imagery. And if we think about phoneme awareness and symbol imagery as being about sort of the parts of reading, right? The individual parts of individual words. We also have to think about, okay, well, what do all these words mean when we put them together on the page? And that's where concept imagery really comes in, right? Concept imagery, I talk about it as that ability to be able to read a book, put it down, walk into the other room and be able to summarize what it was that you just read, because you can still picture what it was that occurred, right? And when we summarize, we're not just saying place names and dates and things like that, but we can actually provide a summary. And if you've ever had a book that you really love reading turned into a movie, and you go and you see that movie, you've probably had that experience where you look at it and you go, that doesn't look right to me. That doesn't match the way that I pictured that. That's what good concept imagery is, right? Mm-hmm. So these ideas of symbol imagery and concept imagery really come from what's called the dual coding theory. And the dual coding theory is a unified theory of literacy. It was created by a gentleman named Alan Pavio years ago. And Alan Pavio really talked about how there was this mental imagery or mental representations and language, that these are two great mental codes and they need to be integrated together, right? In order for folks to understand things. And that our students are going to differ pretty widely in terms of their ability to access these sensory systems. And I talk about, or I think about the dual coding theory in terms of, if someone's to walk up to me and is speaking to me in Spanish, I might be able to locate all of the sounds. I can hear and perceive all of those sounds. I might even be able to sound out the words on the page. But if they're not creating pictures in my mind, I can't understand what it is that that person is talking about or what it is that I'm reading, right? And that's the dual coding theory at its core. And there really are two types of imagery. There's imagery for parts, and there's imagery for wholes. And symbol imagery, as we discussed, is that ability to connect sounds and letters within words. So you can think about the individual letters and the sounds that go with those for the word like clown. And then there's concept imagery, that ability to just picture what it is that a clown looks like. And it's important to think about these as being distinct cognitive functions, right? Some students will be really adept at symbol imagery, but not concept imagery, and vice versa. So again, symbol imagery being that sensory cognitive function for orthographic and phonological processing. And Heidi, I think that when, you first were thinking about your students, you were seeing a lot of students who were struggling with some of these sorts of symptoms. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that is 100% accurate. Yes.
Yeah. And sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry. In each of those areas for sure.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that was interesting when I was thinking about your students is that these were not just elementary school age students. These were secondary students. Is that correct?
Yes, they were actually, when we were looking at it, we were looking at our middle school students, that population, and specifically the 8th graders who were really struggling coming out of the pandemic.
Yeah. Yep. And so you can imagine at the 8th grade level, if students are having difficulty sounding out words, if they're having trouble holding on to sight words, if they're just not fluent readers, that's going to impact them across all of the different content that they have to meet. It's going to impact their ability to read word problems. which is primarily what they're going to be doing. It's going to impact science, everything that they're having trouble with, right?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Heidi.
Oh, I was going to say that for sure. And that's why we looked at the eighth graders as they moved into high school, being able to comprehend and then read the content level curriculum that they had to read. And so we needed to really clean that up.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think particularly as you go into high school and then you start to worry about credits, right? And so that really impacts, well, how do I provide intervention at a high school level when my students are worried about credit hours, right? And so a lot of folks have focused on Scarborough's reading rope as an idea of this integration of all of the different pieces that go together in terms of reading. And a lot of the focus has been on that word recognition area, right? Phonological awareness, decoding, as we talked about earlier, developing students' symbol imagery in order to help with their sight recognition. That those are all parts of decoding and word recognition. But then there's also all of these pieces of language comprehension, right? And lots of folks are talking about structured literacy and all of the different components that go into a structured literacy program. What I think is important to emphasize is we want to make sure that we're not just thinking about these as boxes to be checked off, right? Am I teaching background knowledge? Check. Am I teaching vocabulary? Check. Am I asking students inferencing questions? Check. But how do students develop the skill to acquire vocabulary? How do they develop the skill to inference about information that they're bringing in, whether they're reading that or hearing it orally? And that really does go to that end of the language processing spectrum that has to do with concept imagery, right? And that there are students who may develop really strong decoding skills but still do not comprehend what it is that they just decoded, right? And at the far end of this language processing spectrum, we might say these are students with autism, many of whom are hyperlexic, so they can decode just about anything but can't comprehend it. But there are students sprinkled throughout this language processing spectrum who have varying degrees of weaknesses in these areas, and we need to determine where their strengths and weaknesses are and then provide the right intervention to those kids. And just to talk a little bit more about concept imagery, because it's generally less understood than something like symbol imagery, but concept imagery really is that sensory information that prevents language from coming in one ear and going out the other, right? I often talk about it as when I'm tired late at night, I might sit down and read a book, and I get to the bottom of the page, and if I'm really tired, what do I end up saying when I get to the bottom of the page, Heidi?
You say, what did I just read?
What did I just read? And it's not that I didn't decode those words. I did. I read all those words. I just wasn't engaged in that intentional process of creating images in my mind for that language, right? And that's what happens for a lot of our students when they're sitting in the classroom. They may be holding on to bits and pieces of information. So they may memorize details or facts, but they're not synthesizing that into a whole. And so these students will have difficulty not only with written language comprehension, but also oral language comprehension. If we think really big picture, that's what kids need to have when they leave high school. You need to have good oral language comprehension skills so that they can be critical thinkers, so that they can be problem solvers, right? A weakness in concept imagery impacts very basic things like students' ability to follow directions, especially multiple step directions. And it also impacts on a basic level students' ability to express their thoughts and express language orally. I think in school, we focus a ton on writing, and we say to students, I want you to read a couple passages and then write a summary. But we often don't ever focus on, can they first verbalize a summary, right? If they can't verbalize a summary, they're not going to be able to write you a good summary, right? Because now we're talking about punctuation and grammar and spelling and everything else, when really what we need is them to express language orally effectively. Social situations, cause and effect. One of the things that I talk about a lot with this is many students who struggle with concept imagery may be labeled as having attention-related issues. And so folks say, well, they can't comprehend what's happening in the classroom because they're not paying attention. And I'd say maybe we should kind of flip that and say the reason that they're not paying attention is because they can't comprehend what's happening in the classroom. right? And that's a really an underlying issue that presents itself as an attention-related issue, right? And so may get misdiagnosed. So Heidi, I just talked about a lot of different things in there, and you know, as a special ed director, you were thinking about your students at MSAD 75, and you know, what were some of the challenges coming out of the pandemic that you were seeing that made you think, hey, I have a real situation on my hand that we need to dive in and rectify?
Yeah, well, I really appreciate you asking that question. What's interesting for me is that prior to the pandemic, the students that were then in the 8th grade were 6th graders. And I had started tracking them with their reading scores to actually look at our reading programs and see how students were doing. But during the pandemic, we weren't able to track the same way because we weren't meeting the needs the same way that we should be because kids were home or we were on remote learning, and it really was very different at that point. This was, you know, we weren't using Zoom the way that we're using it now or online instruction. So what I really looked at is I really had to look at those students that were really struggling. And it became very clear that these students and their deficits, we needed to have more support. We needed more support for the students, but we also needed more support for the teachers. And then through the use of test scores, we identified a group of those students again after we evaluated them that really needed extra reading instruction. And I knew this because they were also going into high school the following year, and I was seeing students that were reading anywhere between a 1st and 3rd grade level. And These were 8th grade students, so they really lost 2 good years. And they may have not necessarily lost it if the pandemic, but we weren't making any gains. And any gains that we were making prior to the pandemic had just basically stopped. And so at the same time, while we were deciding that we needed to do something different by bringing in the Learning Campus on Center, we were also training our teachers to become instructors in the Lindamood-Bell program, such as Seeing Stars and Visualizing and Verbalizing. And so at the same time, we were addressing the students that had the deficits in reading because we needed that extra support and that extra help. But also we were training our teachers so that we could start to begin to build our own capacity within the district.
Great. And when we looked at that sort of first cohort of students, and again, these were secondary kids, and the model that Lindamood-Bell and MSAD 75 put together was what we call a learning center on campus model. And so Lindamood-Bell staff was providing the instruction to students, and they were getting very intensive instruction. So they were getting 2 hours a day, 5 days a week of instruction in initially just the Seeing Stars program to help these students who, as Heidi's describing, are many years below grade level in terms of reading, to learn how to work on those parts of reading. And after 92 hours of very intensive instruction, what we saw was that students really did make large standard score changes in the parts of reading. So just a little bit of a boost in terms of those students' symbol imagery as measured on a nationally normed assessment helped students also develop their phonemic awareness. As their phonemic awareness increased, we saw changes in their ability to sound out words on the page. And as that got better, so did their spelling, and crucially, that applied over to their reading accuracy, right? And as we all know, as reading accuracy improves, the hope is students will improve in terms of their reading comprehension. That's the whole point of reading. And in fact, we saw that sort of cascade effect happen, right? As those parts of reading improved, so did the whole of reading. And that this looks at the size of the standard score changes, but in terms of percentile, these students moved from the 9th percentile in their reading comprehension, so well below the normal range of the 25th to the 75th. They jumped from the 9th to the 23rd, so right on the cusp of being within the normal range for reading comprehension, which is, again, what we want to get them into. We want to get them into that normal range where students are independent in terms of their reading and in terms of their comprehension, right? So I think, Heidi, you've talked really well about some of the benefits that you saw of being able to go in and see what that intensive instruction looked like when it was being provided by Lindamood-Bell staff, and you got a chance to see the program being done and some things stood out for you. So maybe you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I 100% love the way that the program is designed, the characteristics of it, and sort of this, as I said, the succinct model of reading instruction. And what I mean by that is that when I would walk into a classroom that was set up as the students were online and we have a teacher working with them, what I would see is the students engaged in the program, but I could almost see their growth happening. And what I mean by that too is that if there was a specific area that they had a deficit, so for example, their symbol imagery or their decoding, we would be able to really pinpoint what it was that they were having difficulty with. And as the person sort of looking in from the outside, I could even follow along with them and see exactly where their instruction was going. So I really like that about it. I just really enjoyed the kids' ability to engage, and that they had the positive support throughout. We made a big difference when we had a certified teacher managing, but also being, the proctor, but also learning at the same time that the students were learning, so that we could build that capacity to really see how the program runs and be efficient and succinct and really just a solid format for reading instruction that I think that is needed in schools. And I know that in my schools, this is exactly how I want reading instruction to look like.
That's great. Yeah. And I sort of forgot to mention that when Lindamood-Bell was providing this Learning Center on Campus model, it was online. And we're continuing to do an online service. And so the students are logging on into Zoom, and their teacher is also on Zoom. And then, MSAD 75, Heidi put together a staff person who's there to help with any challenges that the students come up with. But as Heidi's pointing out, she gets to also see and hear that instruction happening and really build her own skills in terms of providing instruction. And Lindamood-Bell's instruction really is about, at its core, a very Socratic interaction between teacher and student. And so we're asking questions, and we're then differentiating the instruction based on the student's responses. And so when they make a mistake, that response is handled in a very positive manner that uses their mistake as the basis for that student to problem solve. And I think what's exciting for all of us as educators to see is when the sort of light bulb goes off for students and they realize, hey, I can fix that mistake myself, right? And that becomes very self-empowering to them. And that's what ultimately provides that sort of intrinsic motivation that we want students to have, right? We might set up a positive rewards system, what have you, but what we're really chasing is that intrinsic motivation. And that's what happens when students begin to rapidly discover they can solve problems themselves. And Heidi, I think that's especially important for secondary students.
Yes. So, for the secondary students, absolutely. Because when you get to the secondary level, you've struggled with reading for a really long time, and it's really sometimes difficult to get these kids to engage. But what was great about Lindamood-Bell, we met weekly. The staff from Lindamood-Bell met weekly. We talked about problem solving. We talked about shifting. We talked about, okay, let's try this instead. And the staff there was absolutely supportive of everything that we suggested, and then provided us with lots of support as to how we might be able to do things a little bit differently. Something that I didn't think about before is that when we first started this, parents were a little bit hesitant because some kids did not do well online during the remote, and that's what they had to go by. But because of the Lindamood-Bell support and the structure of the program, that helped to change things, and we've seen some pretty significant growth this year as well.
That's great. Yeah, and I think, I definitely applaud you, Heidi, for addressing this with secondary students, because I think oftentimes folks feel like it's too late by the time students get to secondary. And they really have been living with years of the impact of not being able to read effectively. And that really impacts how they feel about themselves, right? And leads to lots of other difficulties. And so, Heidi, maybe you can talk a little bit about some of your vision for where you want to go with things, because I think, and we've talked a lot about that sort of learning center on campus model, but you mentioned earlier that simultaneously you've been having your teachers trained in seeing stars and visualizing and verbalizing. And then those teachers, as they go and provide instruction to their students, are getting coaching from Lindamood-Bell staff over Zoom,
Yes.
directly in sessions to help those teachers build through a sort of continuous cycle of improvement, their own skills and their own ability to implement the program. So maybe talk a little bit about, what you were wanting to do when you decided to go down that avenue and where you want to head to.
Yeah, well, there is definitely a need to help teachers to improve their ability to teach reading, because as in special ed, you're often asked to do many different things, and we weren't having experts in those areas, and so I felt like I really needed to have experts in the area of reading instruction. So over the last 4 years, really worked hard and worked very well with Lindamood-Bell staff to first help my teachers to get trained. During the pandemic, it was hard because we were remote, but then right after the pandemic, we started to lose staff and it was hard to fill positions. So I had to be really creative and finding a different way to do this. And during the pandemic, when we did this, I thought that Lindamood-Bell teams were so responsive to our needs. And I said, well, let's just continue this for another year and see where it goes. And so in that time, we've trained 9 different teachers in different schools. I think it's at least 9. And we provided the coaching model, which the staff are really just going above expectation. And we're starting to see some real growth within the teachers. At the same time, how do we put this model into our system without Lindamood-Bell? And that is the plan to move forward eventually, is to have our own staff doing the same thing and set it up more as a clinical model where we can identify these needs early and get these students the instruction they need for the amount of hours that is recommended through Lindamood-Bell. So yeah, my real dream is to have this, this model, this clinical reading model, really the teacher focuses solely on reading instruction. Because as case managers and teachers for special education, you not only have to teach, but you also have to carry a caseload. And sometimes that can be anywhere from 15 to 25 students. But in my vision, what I see is that these teachers in the clinical reading model focusing on just reading instruction and then providing the data of where they started and then ending for these students and helping them with their ability to maximize growth and the gains that they'll have on this. And I see that as working, eventually, just is going to take a little time to get there.
Yeah. And I think it's so important to have that plan and that vision, because I do think, Heidi, that as we were talking about earlier, that's sort of the challenge that everybody's faced with, right? There has been an opportunity for districts to really try out new solutions to challenges, and there's been funding that's been available to deal with the challenges that the very real challenges coming out of the pandemic. But now some of that's going to go away. And so districts are going to have to figure out how to build this themselves, support it themselves, keep the things that work, shed the things that aren't working, and really streamline where the focus and attention is going. So, it's important to hold on to some of the ideas that I know folks know about, but want to make sure that you're consciously and intentionally thinking about as folks do develop those sorts of comprehensive implementations that we really focus at Lindamood-Bell on talking about sensory cognitive instruction as underlying good reading skills, and that professional development workshops are the first step. But as all of the research has shown, and as Heidi's talking about, teachers need more than just an initial workshop, right? They really do need job-embedded PD, so in real-time feedback on how it is that they're implementing the program. And then the ability to take a look at data, similar to what we were talking about before with these secondary students, right? Most assessments, secondary students, we don't have a really good idea of how they're doing in their phonemic awareness or their symbol imagery or their word attack. But those are going to be crucial if we're going to design an intervention for them. So how do we look at data to help determine how to group students homogenously to provide the best instruction? And then make sure that we're doing things like outreach to principals, right? So Heidi sits in a seat that is over special education, but often the person who's really in charge of what happens in the school is that principal, Right? So how well does the principal understand the importance of the programs and the need for the students to get that instructional time? How well does the family understand that? How well do the other teachers in the building understand the program who work with those kids? And as we build that understanding, you can really start to build capacity within a district and sustain it over time, right? All of those pieces are necessary for it to be sustained, obviously with the goal ultimately that we're going to improve student outcomes, right? And Heidi, I really think you've got such a great vision for that, and I really appreciate that.
Thanks, Dave. No, I'm excited about it. It's even gone down to my elementary level with our resource room teachers and my elementary special ed coordinator and our new clinical reading sort of supervisor that we hired over the last couple of years as well, really starting to look at that data and using the teachers and the training that they've had to be a part of that programming. And they're really starting to bring it in and see it more globally than they did before, which is just, to me, that's like checkbox for my, okay, we did it, so we can keep doing this. So that's the conversation is becoming more widespread, and I'm pretty excited about that.
That's great. That's dynamite. Yeah, that's where we need that conversation to be happening too, right?
Yes.
And I'll leave folks with sort of this, one of my favorite quotes talking about the role of what real professional development should look like. Because again, I think, it's important to know that we can't just provide a program to teachers and say, hey, I want you to go out and go do this program and we're going to see results and look at those. But that it is really important that some key pieces be in place, that teachers can see some high quality lessons, that they get to co-teach with an expert in the program, and then they can receive feedback based on that so that they can grow their own improvement. And that really we need to know that this is going to take time, right? It can't be just a one-stop thing. It can't be just outside of the classroom, but it needs to happen in the classroom in real time as teachers are working with students. And that ultimately we're looking for 30 or more hours of actual solid in the classroom professional development in order for someone to build the capacity to provide this type of really good, solid, intensive instruction to students that's going to help them develop the underlying skills they need and to be able to close the gaps when they appear.
Yeah.
Great. So, that I think is the bulk of our presentation. Heidi, I want to say thank you so much for joining us today. I don't know if you had any final closing thoughts that you wanted to share.
Yeah, I think that your presentation, Dave, is exactly the reason why I went into a partnership with you and your staff. So clear, evidence-based. You provide the research to back it up, and it's so organized. It's just it's great. So thank you.
Great. And thank you all for joining us for this Leaders in Literacy webinar. Make sure to stop by our website, Lindamood-Bell.com. And if you click on the For Schools button there are a series of past webinars that we've held with folks like Heidi from around the country who've been implementing Lindamood-Bell's programs in their districts. And by all means, certainly reach out. You can see my contact information there, and Heidi's been generous enough to share her contact information as well. And I know that she'd love to share her thoughts about how things have gone in MSAD. So thank you all so much for joining us today.
And thank you for listening. Learn more about us at lindamoodbell.com. You can also find us on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. We are Lindamood-Bell.